Hello friends, my name is Dan Vega, and if this is the first time you're visiting this channel, I'm a Spring Developer Advocate for VMware, and in today's tutorial, we're going to be talking about building out CRUD endpoints for your GraphQL API on the server side. So before we get started, this is my website, danvega.dev. You can go learn a whole bunch of stuff on there. Along with, if you go all the way to the bottom of the page, there's a bunch of icons here for the different social networks I'm on. There's this little bird here, and that bird says, hey, we're on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, go over there, follow me, twitter.com/therealdanvega. I don't know. I had to come up with something, right? So, hey, learn stuff about me here. I'll get a whole bunch of free content. But let's talk about what we're here to learn about today, and that's Spring for GraphQL. So I have a bunch of content on this channel, on my website, around Spring for GraphQL. One of the things that I've heard is through some feedback is I want to see more of a full CRUD example. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to start with some starting code. We'll walk through that code. I don't want this to turn into like an hour tutorial. So I've got some just really minimal starting code that you can clone off of a repo and kind of follow along with me if you want. And what we'll do is we'll build out all of the CRUD, well, CRUD plus L, right, list. So create, write, read, update, delete, and list. We'll create all of those endpoints in our GraphQL controller, and we'll see how that works as far as like creating the schema and tying those two together. So with that, head over to github.com/danvega. There's a repo called GraphQL test. The link for that will be in the description below. The master branch is going to be the final source code. The starter branch is where I'm going to start. And what we'll do is we'll head over to IntelliJ and I'll walk you through that, and then we'll start building out the GraphQL bits. So what are we waiting for? Let's jump on in. All right, here we are in IntelliJ, and the reason that this project is called GraphQL-test is because I'm going to use this as a follow-up. The next video that you see, we'll use the same set of code and we'll go through and we'll write some tests against this same application that we're building here. So again, I didn't want to start from scratch. It will take too long. So let's just walk through this very simple Spring Boot application. We have two models, a coffee, that is a record. So it has an ID, a string name, and a size. So you'll notice if you frequent Starbucks, these are pretty similar to that. We have a short, tall, grande, and venti. And so those are the types of sizes we can have. We have a coffee service. So instead of using a database, I'm just using a service to encapsulate kind of the data for our application. So we have a list of coffee called coffees. We have, if we look all the way at the bottom, there's a post construct. So this is a method that will allow us to go ahead and this will be executed after dependency injection is done to perform any initialization. So I call this method init. It doesn't return anything. All we're doing is adding 3 coffees to the lists. So we have our Cafe Americano, size grande, Cafe Latte, size venti, Cafe Caramel Macchiato, size tall. So we have 3 coffees in there, and from there we can find all. So return all the coffees, we can find one, we can create, we can update, and delete. So the important part about this is, and if you've seen my videos before, this will start to resonate with you, that our GraphQL does not care about the data in our application. It is independent of data. So when you're asking questions like, how does GraphQL retrieve information from a database, you're asking the wrong question. We are going to delegate that to some code in our application. In this case, when we have a controller, we're going to delegate the data part off to the coffee service. So it's independent of that. It's not tied to any database or any storage mechanism. Important to note. So that's all there is to it. There's not a lot going on here. In our application.properties, we've enabled the graphical interface. So we can go ahead and check out and validate our queries. So the first thing we need to do when we start is we're going to create a new directory here. This is by convention. You can change this if you want. I don't see any real benefit in doing so. And then what we need to do is create any type of schema in here. So I'm going to call this schema.graphqls. The front part of this isn't important. You can call this whatever you want. You can create multiple schemas, but the end of this is we're going to use the GraphQLS extension. So now what we need to do is we need to come in here and we need to create some different types. So if you haven't watched my introduction to Spring for GraphQL, I'll go ahead and link to this maybe in a card above, but at least in the description below. And that will give you a bit of more introduction into kind of types and what they are. But the first thing that we need is we need our object types. So we have a type for coffee. And again, this is going to mimic exactly what this is. So in our case, we're going to have an ID, a name, and a size. So let's say the left side is the name of the field. The right side is the type. So I'm going to say name, string, size, size. And now size does not exist, so we'll have to create an enum for size. And this is just going to mimic this. So short, tall, grande, venti. So short, tall, grande, venti. Okay, so far so good. Now what we need to do is we need to start building out our queries and our mutations. So we have these top level root operations, one of which is query. And we are going to say we want to go ahead and find all. And so find all is the name of the query. What it's going to return is a list of coffees. So we're going to say, let's go ahead and return a list of coffees. And at the very least, this is not going to be null. It just may be an empty collection. So great, we have our first query. Let's go ahead and write our controller to go ahead and have some kind of method that can retrieve all of our coffees. So we'll come in here and we'll say this is going to be a coffee controller. Inside a coffee controller, we're going to go ahead and make this a controller. This is how Spring for GraphQL is going to find your different GraphQL API controllers. So what we need to do now is we need to start with our coffee service. So we need an instance of this. So I'm going to say coffee service, and we'll get this via dependency injection through constructor injection here. And we're going to create our first method, which is going to be public list, list of coffees, and we'll call this find all. And this is just going to return whatever that coffee service.findAll method is. So that's our first method. Now, how are we going to tie this method to this query name? So one way that you can do this is, and again, I've mentioned this before, if this is going to repeat for you, I'm sorry. I just want to make sure that anyone new coming along understands this. So we can use a schema mapping, and a schema mapping takes a couple arguments. So one is type name, and the type here is going to be query because we are using the top level operation query. So let's go ahead and use query there. And then we give it a value, and then the value is really the name of the query. So in this case, it's find all, and so we would say find all. So this is a little bit verbose. So like everything in Spring, that usually is an easier option. Just like we can in a REST controller, instead of saying request mapping method equals get, we have these specialized annotations or composed annotations. And this gives us a way to just say at get mapping instead of the longer version of that. Similarly, we have at query mapping here. And what this does is it will infer the type name is going to be query, and then the value is going to be derived from the method name. So as long as the method name matches this name here, then everything is okay. So this is all we actually need to kind of hook those two up. So let's go ahead and clean this up. Let's run back here and let's go ahead and run our application. We will jump over to, something's already started. This is usually a problem for me. Let's go ahead and fix this. This is why I usually check my application at first to see if something is already running, because it's usually the case. So we're just going to kill this process. Here's the PID is 27583. And at this point, we should be able to go ahead and run our application now and have no errors. Great. So now what we're going to do is head over to the browser. All right, so once your application is running, if you go over to the web browser and go to localhost 8080/GraphQL, again, that's because we enabled that. It is disabled by default, so you need to enable it in your properties. So if we go over here, we get this nice graphical interface that we can kind of validate and test our queries in. So here we are in the Documentation Explorer. We can see the root type of query. There is one, so we have one query called find all that will return to us a list of coffee. So we can go ahead and type out our query here. So we're going to start with query. We're going to say find all, and we're going to say we want the ID, the name, and the size. And if we go ahead and run that, we should see all three of our coffees there, and we do. So, okay, so far so good. Again, this is stuff we've already done together, but we've got our first step. We were able to list out all of the coffees. Now we need to be able to create, read, update, and delete. So actually, let's go ahead and start back with the query, with the schema. And we're going to create a new query here. We'll call it find one. This is going to take an argument. So it's going to take an argument of type of name ID. It's going to be of type ID, and this will return a single coffee. So let's go ahead and save that. Go back to the coffee controller. We're going to go ahead and make a query mapping here, and we'll say this is going to return. So if you look at the coffee service and our find one, it actually returns an optional of coffee. So we want to say optional of coffee. We'll call this find one. So this is going to take an integer ID as an argument. And what it's going to return is the coffee service.find one and passing in the ID. Now we need something to map the named GraphQL argument onto this method parameter the same way that you would if you were, say, using a path variable in a REST API. We have an annotation for this called @argument. So we'll say @argument, and now that'll get mapped to this method parameter, and then we pass that over to the find one method. So from there, we should be able to go ahead and rerun this. So I'm going to run this, head over to the web browser, and I need to refresh this so it finds that find one method. So I'm going to say find one. Needs to take an ID. We'll just say number one, and I'm going to get the ID. That's coming up. ID, name, size. And we'll go ahead and run that, and there's our single coffee. Okay, again, stuff we've kind of done before together. Now let's take a look at what we need to do to create, update, and delete. So this is our root type of query. Anytime we're reading data, whether it's finding all of them, reading just a single one, we're using that query type. Whenever we're changing data that's creating, updating, or deleting, we're using a type called a mutation. So that's our mutation. And what we want to do is we'll go ahead and just create our create method. So this is going to be called create. This is going to take some arguments. So if we look in our coffee service, we find out how does this work. It's going to take a name and a size, and it will create that ID for us. So all we really need to be worried about in this case is a name and a size. So we're going to go ahead and say that name is a string and size is a size, and then it is going to return. So this is kind of the, well, for create it's okay, but this is one of the weird things for me with GraphQL is you need to return something, like you can't say void here, which kind of stinks because there are certain situations like a delete where I don't really want to return something. But what we're going to return here is our coffee. So there's our create. Let's go ahead and go back over to the coffee controller. So now similarly, we can use that @schema mapping annotation, but we have a specialized annotation for mutation, and as you would guess, it's mutation mapping. So we're going to say we're going to return a coffee, and this is going to be called create. Let's just return null for a second. So create is going to take two arguments. It's going to take a string name, and a size. So again, these are going to be bound from GraphQL named arguments to the method parameters. So we're going to say @argument. And now what we can do is we can call our coffee service.create and pass in a name and pass in a size. So that should give us everything we need. Again, we're calling this create here. We're calling this create in our schema. So those two line up so we can use that app mutation mapping. Should be able to run this, and if there are no errors, we can head back over to here and refresh this. And I can come in here and do this if I wanted to. What I want to do is a mutation. All right, so we're going to say create. This create takes a couple of arguments. So the first is name. We'll just call this hot coffee. And then we need a size. And the size is going to be, let's just say, tall. So this is going to return that specific coffee. It's actually going to give us back that ID. We can say name and size. So if we go ahead and run this, we do get back. We see that there were 3 in the system before. There are now 4. So we could easily kind of get rid of this and say query if we run them all, we can see we get 1, 2, 3, 4. So we know that our mutation mapping is working for our create. So now let's talk about what we need to do with the update. So if we look at our coffee service, this is going to take an integer ID, so it needs to know which coffee it's working on. It's going to take the new name and the new size. So we're just going to create a new coffee instance. We will find that one. If it's there, we'll get the index and update that coffee. Or if you pass me an illegal ID, so like 99, it's going to throw a legal argument exception and then just return that updated coffee. So this is going to look pretty similar. We're going to say update, but this time we'll go ahead and take an ID. We'll take a name, string, and we'll take a size, which is size. And this is going to, again, return coffee. So let's see, that is going to be pretty similar to this. Let's do what you should never do, and that's copy and paste. But we're going to call this update. I'm going to add one more argument here, and we're going to call this integer ID. And then we're going to call the update method. So we'll pass in the ID, the name, and the size. And that's that. So let's go ahead and restart this. No errors. All right, good start. Let's see if we can go ahead and update one. So, since we inserted, or since we restarted, we're gonna end up with just the 3. So let's just go ahead and update like the first one. So let's say mutation, and what we want to do is we want to update, and we're going to pass in the ID, which is going to be 1. We're going to pass in the name, which is going to be new name, and then we'll pass in the size, which is going to be short. So from there, we can go ahead and say I just want the ID, the name, and the size, and we'll go ahead and run that, and you see that we have updated the one with the ID of 1 to a new name. Just to be sure, we can go ahead and take a look at this one. So you can leave all these in here and not do what I'm doing, commenting, uncommenting. If you give them kind of named, like if you name your query and you name your mutation, I'm just kind of doing this quickly. So, but if we look at this, number 1 has a new name, 2 is cafe latte, and so on. Okay, so we're getting there. Almost done. We just need to work on a delete. Before we do that, let's head over to the coffee service, and the delete simply takes an integer ID. It will go ahead and turn that coffees list into a stream, filter for that ID. It will try to find it, or else it will throw an illegal argument exception. If it can find it, it will remove it and return the coffee. So pretty simple here. We just say delete, ID is ID. And again, that's going to return the coffee. So let's say in here, again, it's a mutation mapping. It's going to return the coffee. We'll call it delete. It's going to be an argument of integer ID, and it's going to return the coffee service.delete, and that should be that. So let's go ahead and restart this application. Nothing happens. It looks like we're good. Again, I think what we'll do here is let's go ahead and add one. So if we do this, cool. So now we have 4. And if we go ahead and write our new mutation, so we're going to say mutation, delete. We'll delete, let's say, the ID of number 2. And that'll give me back the ID, the name, and the size. And now, if we go ahead and find all, we have 1, 3, and 4. We have deleted that second entry. So I think that's really what I wanted to get into in this tutorial. This is going to kind of lay the groundwork for the next tutorial. As I said, we're going to go through and write some tests against this. But this came up because I got some questions. You know, some of the examples that I've shown have been really simple and just had the query. You just had the query mappings. So I know people wanted to see the mutation mappings. I've also got some requests for subscriptions. So the 3 top level types in GraphQL are query, mutation, and subscription. So I'll see if I can put together something on some type of tutorial on that. If you're interested in that or something else related to GraphQL, please go ahead and leave me a comment below. Let me know. I'd love to put something together for you. But as always, I really hope you found some value in this video. If you did, friends, please go ahead and give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.